Welcome to the third episode of The Right Side of Maby, the global guessing podcast where we speak with forecasters about their backgrounds, past forecasts, and how we can all improve at quantified forecasting. Today we are joined by a special guest, Tom Liptay. Tom is a super forecaster and one of the best around. He placed first in the Good Judgement Project 2013 Season 3 cohort, as well as he was on the first place team at the Good Judgement Project Season 4 tournament. He also holds a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT and a CFA. He is also the co-founder of Maby, a forecasting platform designed to help companies and investors both manage risks and make good predictions. Tom is also a runner and a cyclist, so we'll see if his forecasting chops have helped him in the athletic world as well. Without further ado, Tom, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward to this.
So, Tom, we reached out to you because you have a very impressive COVID forecasting background. But before we get into that, we'd like to sort of, as Andrew was saying in the intro, talk about your background into the space of quantified forecasting. How and when were you first introduced to this concept of quantified forecasting? It seems like you joined Good Judgement Project early on, so how'd you hear about that topic? What sold you on the idea of it? And what got you engaged into becoming a better forecaster?
Yeah, I think my journey started with trying to become a better investor. I'm a Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger fanatic. I read those guys probably back in 2001, kind of became obsessed with them and, realized that big part of investing is essentially forecasting company returns, what's going to happen economically. So that got me into the whole psychology of cognitive bias and trying to identify it in myself and correct it if possible. So I probably first learned about forecasting from Tetlock's book, Expert Political Judgment, which was a long running, I think the first of its kind, studied political scientists over like a 20-year period. And yeah, that's where it started for me. I was also a kind of quantified forecasting. I realized that it was important to be well calibrated, and so even well before the Good Judgement Project started, I would give myself calibration quizzes on trivia questions with known answers, and then grade myself to see if I was in fact well calibrated. I practiced that over hundreds of questions.
And what's the benefit of being well calibrated for our listeners who might not know?
Yeah, just when I say there's a 70% chance of rain tomorrow, I would like it to be that it actually rains 70% of the time when I say that, as opposed, well, most people will end up being overconfident when they start. So you'll say 90% and it will only happen 70% of the time. And so you can imagine as an investor, you wouldn't want to do that. And as a forecaster, you don't want to do that. You just have an inaccurate view of the world. So practicing these calibration quizzes can help give you the feedback to find out if indeed you are overconfident, and then correct it.
And when you first started your forecasting process, what did you consider most critical to your skill development? And particularly thinking about at the start of your forecasting process, not, as you became a super forecaster and then became the super of the super forecasters, but at the start of that process, what did you consider most important?
Yeah, for me, I did a lot of reading of the psychological literature. Michael Mauboussin, Phil Tetlock, Danny Kahneman, all those guys. I was pretty well read in those books. And I think what I still take the most just absolute pure joy in is when I was unaware of these cognitive biases, I would read the question that they ask people. I would try to answer it myself, and then they would reveal, Danny Kahneman or Amos Tversky would reveal like, okay, so here were the experimental results, and indeed, 8 times out of 10, I would fall into the exact same trap that others fell into, which you could then show was logically inconsistent. And I found that absolutely fascinating, that they could predict exactly how I was going to be irrational. So I still take pure joy whenever I can find one of those things that I'm unaware of. And I think that that helped me a lot. Going, I was extremely well versed before I made my first forecast for Good Judgment Project.
And do you think that helped you become a super forecaster faster than others by doing a lot of prep work before just hopping in?
I think so, because I mean, and also doing the calibration quizzes myself. I tried to practice as much as I could by myself. So I got no, I really didn't learn anything new from the training that they provided. I'd read all that for a decade before.
And so then getting back to what you were talking about before, you know, I imagine that the margins of improvement as you become a better forecaster may shrink. What were some of the skills and what was your experience sort of developing as a super forecaster as you sort of got better and became more comfortable with forecasting?
I can say one thing that I mistake I made, I think that I learned during Good Judgment Project is that the status quo bias is very powerful, um, and that things take a long time to change in the real world. So I made a few forecasts where it was, will this trade deal get signed? And I would say 30%. And then a year would go by and it wouldn't get signed. And then they'd ask the same question again the next year. Will the trade deal get signed? And I'd say 30%. And then it wouldn't get signed again. And then, that happened on a few of these things. And maybe that's the biggest mistake I made and the biggest thing I learned from forecasting.
So is the status quo bias having a greater, like thinking that the world can change faster than it really can?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Things take a long time to change.
Yeah, now that you mention that, I think that's something that we have in our forecast is very much thinking just ignoring the reality of the status quo as it is right now. It's good to have a name for it. When it comes to forecasting, how much time do you spend every week forecasting, and how do you split up that time between sorting through questions, doing research, rethinking past forecasts? How does that? How do you break down your forecasting time, and what does it look like?
Yeah, honestly, right now I do very little forecasting. I now have 3 kids and trying to do a bunch of other stuff. But during the Good Judgment Project days, it I'm a competitive guy. I wanted to see if I could win. I would probably spend an average of 2 hours a day, um, maybe even 3 hours a day. It was probably something in that range. That was my effectively my video game to de-stress. It was just a game that you're trying to win, but you just got the feedback over a very long period of time.
And did you, thinking about just the game part, did you like that the feedback came out over time, or would it have been nice to have like some more short fused feedback as well rather than just long term one? Like we've been forecasting now a while on Metaculous, and I think we just crossed 3 months on for Metaculous Monday, so public forecast. And I think in that period of time, only 3 questions have closed and only 2 have resolved
Yeah.
um, yet. And that kind of makes it in some ways difficult to sort of get feedback because you can always sort of do some post mortem before things have closed, but it's usually good to wait for the event to happen. And so, do you think there should be sort of more short fuse forecasting too?
I think a mix is great. I mean, the kind of feedback that I'm always most interested in as a forecaster and as an investor is really my long-term forecasting. When I make an investment, I'm always trying to think 5 to 10 years into the future. That's just the kind of investor I am. Um, but the huge challenge is if you are trying to make a 10-year forecast, you don't get very many rounds of feedback during a lifetime. I mean, if you started at age 0 and you lived to age 80, you'd only get 8 rounds of feedback in your entire life. Of course, no one starts at age 0. So that's just one of these really tough challenges. I don't know any way around it. But I think short-term feedback's great because at least then you get something where you can make a correction and hopefully that helps your longer term forecasts. But maybe that's not true. I'm not sure.
And then just one more follow up on that. Do you think there's a limit on how long term forecasts can be? I remember reading a paper, I think when it was came to AI forecasting, looking at experts, or could have been nuclear weapon development forecasting, where it's, I think after 5 or 10 years, forecast accuracy just kind of falls off a cliff. Do you sort of try to keep your long term forecasts limited to a certain duration, or do you kind of just forecast any sort of duration of question?
I've been I haven't been great about keeping uh, making super long term forecasts. I know Metaculus has them, and I have not taken part in that as much as I probably should have. I toy with the idea of doing it for investing, trying to predict companies' revenues 10 years from now, but I've also been bad at that. I'm thinking of trying to do that, but I've been thinking about that for a while and haven't done it.
So, for instance, for forecasts like, trying to forecast revenues many, many years into the future, these questions that are not very simple, do you have sort of like a mental heuristic for how much time you'll spend on that initial forecast? And does that change, depending on if the question that you're approaching is um, easier, or if it's more complex like this one?
And how do you determine whether a question is going to be an easy one to forecast versus a complex one?
Um, yeah, well, I think a lot of it just depends on your background knowledge. So if it's something I know nothing about, it's obviously going to take me a lot longer to even make the simplest, most basic forecast. And if I know a lot about something already, then it might only take me a minute because I've already thought about it. Um, yeah, but maybe what you're getting at, or maybe a nugget, it'd be I think there is value in even making um, 5 minute forecasts. You just have to be humble that you've only looked at this complex thing for 5 minutes, so like really probably shouldn't have a very extreme view. And if there is a consensus, you really don't have the background to diverge from the consensus by very much. If you want to make something that's off consensus and there's a lot of smart people looking at it,
Do
like
your due diligence.
you have to spend days before you can do that.
Yeah, so actually just building on top of that, in episode 2 of The Right Side of Maybe, we talked to David Mannheim, um, and we brought up this idea of a minimal valuable forecast as sort of the minimum amount of investment you have to put into a question to gain enough experience and calibration to sort of become a better forecaster. And you had just talked about, you can even do a 5 minute forecast, but it should therefore be more so basing it off of maybe a community median and then finding your direction based on that and moderating on the extremes, maybe not going above 90% or going below 10% if you're putting in a very little amount of time. What is your opinion on this idea of a minimal valuable forecast, and what do you think would be some of the characteristics of such a forecast, both from an investment and from a thinking perspective in terms of tackling a forecasting question?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can get valuable feedback really on any time scale. So I used to give myself these factual calibration quizzes where I would only spend, let's say, 20 seconds answering. And you answer 40 of them, 20 minutes later, you get your calibration curve back. And I think you do get valuable feedback from that, even just spending 20 seconds. You just have to be humble that you haven't spent much time and you don't really know very much. So you be very careful about being overconfident. Um, so I don't know. Maybe I come down in a different place. I think there can be value on really all time scales. If you want to test whether you're beyond calibration, there's also this concept of discrimination. So um, in order to get a good discrimination score, I think you really need to, one, you need a benchmark to compare against, because otherwise it's very, I don't know what a calibration score in isolation, sorry, I don't know what a discrimination score in isolation would mean.
And what is a discrimination score exactly?
Or even a Briar, maybe just keep it even simpler, a Briar score. Like I could give myself questions about predicting the weather in my town, and I could do that for 100 days. I could get a calibration curve. I could also get a Briar score. The calibration curve is really useful to me because I can see whether, when I say 70%, it actually rains 70% of the time. But my Briar score is really pretty meaningless in isolation because, okay, let's say I got a zero point 0.2 Briar score. Is that good? Is that bad? You really have no idea. You need other people or some kind of benchmark to compare against. Um, and so in order to, and that's a huge part of being a better forecaster, obviously, a better meteorologist. And in order to really judge yourself on that dimension, you really do need to spend a lot of time. Because if you only spend 20 seconds on it, yeah, I'm not going to be a good forecaster. Even if I'm perfectly calibrated, I still won't be a very good forecaster. So if you want to find out if you're good, you need someone to compete against, and you need to spend time.
So, speaking of competition, that brings us to the main part of this week's episode of The Right Side of Maby, which is going through your series of COVID forecasts. Um, if you guys would like to follow along and see the questions that we'll be talking about, you can go to Maby, Maby .app/COVID. And this was really cool. So, if I have it correct, you sort of set up a COVID forecasting competition, say, between yourself and a series of public health experts that were funded by the CDC. And you had a series of questions regarding about COVID that I see is still going on. Um, and you had a series of questions and you calculate the Briar scores for yourselves and the experts. And over time, you have come out on the right side of maybe more than the panel experts. Your Briar score on average is a 0.246, while there's a 0.268, which I believe means on average you were 7.5% on average closer in the right direction of positive resolution than the experts, which is quite impressive. Could you give us a little bit more background in terms of what this forecasting competition was like and how you approached the range of forecasting questions, which ranged from how many deaths will there be in the United States or a particular state, as well as how many COVID cases there would be in a given week?
Yeah. So really, it was a Tom McAndrew and Nicholas Reich who are two researchers at UMass. They basically asked these forecasting questions to between 20 to 40 of their colleagues at pretty prestigious places, Harvard, John Hopkins. These are all epidemiologists. All the questions were about COVID, and they asked about 5 questions every week and published them. And so basically, what I did is I wanted to see if I how I would do against their group of experts, whether a generalist like me by himself could compete against them, but someone who's a expert forecaster but knows nothing about disease. So what I would do is I would just kind of in real time make forecasts on the same exact questions, and then once they resolved, I would give us both Briar scores. So that's how it came about. I had no control over the questions, and I had no direct relationship with the UMass researchers. I just did this by myself, and so by now, it stopped. There were about 30 questions. My Briar score ended up being better than their panel on coronavirus. forgot where I was going on this. What was the
How did you sort of approach these
yeah, how did
forecasting questions for
yeah,
COVID?
yeah. So for I mean, there's no one size fits all, but typical if I was predicting deaths or something, I'd look at the data. Um, typical, I might say, well, let's say it's an exponential. You can fit an exponential. That's probably an upper bound. I could say, what if it's linear? Um, I can set a lower bound. If you can quantify a fairly reasonable upper bound and lower bound, then I, ask, well, which should it be closer to the lower or the upper bound? Are these models really good? Is it possible it goes above my upper bound or below my upper bound? And then really spend a lot of time thinking about just the things that might not be in a model that you can't see from the data. Um, and maybe the most interesting thing, and this has served me well both for the COVID forecasting and other forecasting, is forcing myself to write a pre-mortem. So really going through and writing down if I'm wrong, trying to honestly predict how this I'm going to make. And if there was one forecasting tip I would give everybody, I would say that is it. Trying to actively disprove your forecast. In the investing, when I was doing investing before even Good Judgement Project, I would literally say, I really like this investment. I think it's going to do great. And then I'd force myself to write the sketch of a letter to myself to be read by myself in 5 years if the investment turned out horribly. And that's just an incredibly, it's very, it takes an incredible amount of mental effort to really seriously do that, because I'm forcing myself into a world that, um, conflicts with my true beliefs. Um, but I think that served me incredibly well.
Yeah, I think Balkan Devlin, when he was on our weekly podcast, he had mentioned the idea of doing pre-mortems. Is that something that a lot of super forecasters do? Do you think that's something that distinguishes the supers from the non-supers on average?
Yeah, no, I think so. I'll say that even I think it's tough to do a good pre-mortem. I think I see even just talking about myself. I've caught myself trying to do pre-mortems and just kind of like going through the checklist, like, okay, I'll spend a minute, I'll do my pre-mortem. And honestly, that's useful, but it's not. It takes a lot of effort, at least for me, to do a real pre-mortem that's serious. And I don't know how many people put in really, really serious effort to pre-mortems.
So I was wondering, did you do a pre-mortem for oh, wrong one, for this question? How many US states or and territories will report more cases for September compared to June? This is a
Uh,
question where, I mean, everyone did quite poorly on, but
yeah.
this is your worst Briar score of the bunch, a 1.088. This is out of a Good Judgement Briar score out of 2. And I was wondering what if you did a pre-mortem for that and how that ended up comparing to what your post-mortem was for that question.
Yeah, I probably we can find out, because I tried to model good forecasting behavior, and I wrote on Twitter. It's actually not on the website, but I wrote a little summary of my reasoning for every single one of those questions. But I'm modeling very bad behavior because I didn't actually do a postmortem on it and go back and read it. So I don't know.
Well, it'd
Shame
be
on
great.
me.
Um, so moving on to some of the other questions, your best forecast on average looked like they were what the U.S. national COVID cases were. Um, why do you think, not only your best Briar score on average, but also I think the best difference between you and the experts? Why do you think that was the case? That was your strongest forecast? Did you approach that question differently from other questions that led to that greater accuracy there?
So I think my answer to all of these things is probably going to be it's just statistical noise. So I think probably even if you looked at all 30 questions in aggregate, I think that that's the right thing to do. I don't think you can draw almost any conclusion from a single question or even 2 or 3 questions. I think at the level, maybe what I'm saying is, so I came out on top of the competition, but if you asked me, if we reran this competition, what do you think you would win again, Tom? My answer might be, maybe I would have a 2/3 chance of winning. But that's the equivalent of me saying, well, I think I have a 1/3 chance of losing. And so I just think that there's tremendous noise. When I try to do a simulation, I got an Excel spreadsheet. I said, I imagine that there's 2 forecasters competing, a perfect forecaster who says the right probability on every single question, and an imperfect forecaster who is off by 10% on every single question. And now I have 100 questions.
So you have
and
a
I
biased
want
forecaster and
a biased forecaster on every single question off by 10% from the true probability. And I have 100 questions and I give them Briar scores. And maybe I'll throw this question back to you guys. What do you think the probability that the perfect forecaster wins, meaning has the best Briar score in a 100-question tournament?
It's 10% bias, but in no discernible direction, right?
It could be, yeah, sure. It could be either direction, but it's off by exactly 10% in either direction.
Jesus, this is one of those problems where the answer is gonna be is gonna surprise you. I'm just gonna guess it's 50-50 off the bat.
It'd probably be a bit higher, maybe like 65-70.
In terms of
Yeah.
which one, Andrew? Who winning?
The perfect forecaster.
Yeah, well, so the perfect forecaster is going to win more than the imperfect forecaster.
Yeah.
But at least when I try to do this simulation, he would win 85% of the time.
There you go, Andrew. Look at
Which it's so I guess that I use that as a benchmark, because that's just saying, look, you could give people in this coronavirus forecasting competition, there was only 30 questions, but we know that if there's a 100-question quiz and you're perfect and you're beating the other guy by 10% on every one, you're only going to win 85% of the time. 15% of the time you're going to lose, even though you're absolutely perfect. I just think that goes to show you just need a lot of questions before there's enough statistical significance to draw like a really firm conclusion about who's better. After 30 questions, I think I would be lying to myself if I said, "Oh, see, look, I'm better than the experts." I don't think I can say that, at least given the margin of victory. Maybe if it was a really massive blowout, you could say that. But and then given that I don't feel like I can say that after 30 questions, if you ask me like, "Oh, about any specific question, like why did you do better or worse?" I mean, my answer is like, well, there's even way more noise with a single question than with 30. So I try really hard to, any Duke has a term that I think is really relevant, resulting, where that once you know the outcome, it's really difficult to not say, like, if you got a good outcome, it's really hard to not, there's a temptation to say, well, I made a good decision. And if I got a bad outcome, there's a temptation to say, well, I made a bad decision. And I think that that's a mistake, and you can end up learning the wrong lessons. So again, I try really, really hard not to ever do that on any question. I try not to basically ignore the Briar scores on the out for a question. And the only thing I allow myself to think about are, did I identify all the relevant facts? Did I identify in my premortem all the relevant risks? And did I have consistent logic? And if I did all 3 of those things, in my head, I didn't make a mistake. even if I got a terrible Briar score, you can say, Tom, clearly, look, you got a horrible Briar score compared to this other guy. I refuse to take blame. And at this, and the flip side of that is, even if I crush someone on a question, I refuse to take credit for it. So those are kind of my little mental rules. Like I just refuse to take blame or credit on any individual question.
So I want to go back a bit. Speaking of getting better at forecasting, a lot of the forecasters that we've talked to on the right side of Maby and on the Global Guessing Weekly podcast have shared that there are a lot of small things that people can do to become a lot better at forecasting. It's just a matter of sort of education. And one of those things, an example of one of those from the bin paper was teaming. Working with other people can, increase your Briar score.
Yeah.
You said that you looked at these forecasts, these COVID forecasts by yourself. I was wondering, was that a conscious decision? What was your thoughts about working with other people on those forecasts?
Yeah, actually, so that's the super fascinating thing. So I did all these COVID forecasts by myself. And actually, I'll tell you a great story. So in year 3 of Good Judgement Project, was the first year I did it, I was in the control group, which means I was totally isolated from everybody else. I got no feedback on what the group thought. Didn't get to see anyone's comments. It was just me by myself for a year. And I did very well in that. Became a super forecaster, went to this super forecasting conference before year 4 started. And my mind exploded when I found out how good the super teams had done on the same questions I had answered. They had even though I was first in my cohort, the other forecasters working together on teams just were so much better than I was. I couldn't believe it, honestly, at first. And I was a team skeptic. I remember sitting at a table with the other super forecasters. I had never been on a team before, and I was convinced that you were not going to get better forecasts by teaming the supers, that you would get better. I was totally convinced you'd get better forecasts by asking them all the super forecasters independently and then aggregating their forecasts, taking the median, as opposed to having them all be on a team and having them be able to talk. Because I thought there was going to be groupthink, and that people were or there's going to be a dominant personality, or people were going to be lazy once they saw someone else present a good opinion. And so then I joined a team in year 4, and it took me about 2 days before I realized I was completely, totally wrong. It was just crystal clear, even before the outcome of any question, that you got much better forecasts by being on a team of other thoughtful forecasters, because I would write my rationale, and before that, no one would say anything. But now I had teammates, and they would say, Tom, you forgot about this. What do you think about this? Have you considered this? And that feedback and that interaction was incredible. It was just immediately obvious that you were going to do better. And in fact, the team I joined, ended up going on to get the first place in year 4. So that was super fun. That was one of the best team experiences of my life. It was great. It was everyone was focused on a common goal. Everyone was really respectful, but there was never pressure to agree. There was never pressure. There was no leader. There's no official leader saying, "Hey, you need to do this." It was just this group of people who were really fine with challenging each other and not taking it personally, and being nice about it.
And so then going back to the COVID forecast, which you did these by yourselves, I know we just talked about how small sample set of questions, so difficult to sort of make any sort of generalizations about any particular forecasts. But there were some that were like a series of forecasts, and so we can kind of look at trends in terms of Briar's score. And actually, I got this one wrong when I first was reviewing your questions, because I didn't see that they were in reverse chronological order. But one thing was with your COVID death forecast, that those got less accurate over time, and I was just wondering if is one potential hypothesis that you were basing it on early models in the pandemic that had sort of incomplete testing numbers. And so the ratio between confirmed cases versus actual cases was off, which would therefore skew the COVID death rate that you were getting. And then over time, as testing capacity increased, you were then getting a more equal ratio between test positives and then fatalities that would then come 4 to 6 weeks later. Do you think that could have been attributed to the loss? Do you think it's just noise and we're looking too granular in terms of trends?
Yeah, so I would not. Again, my little rule is I wouldn't look at any of the Briar scores. I wouldn't. I'd worry I'd draw the wrong conclusions. But I don't want to dodge complete responsibility. The biggest mistake that I made was the IHME for a while had a model before other people had models. Um, and I did not fully understand all the assumptions that went into it. And I got lulled into a false sense of confidence in believing, putting too much weight on what the IHME um, was saying. And I mean, in retrospect, it's pretty clear what my mistake was. I didn't understand the assumptions that were going into it. And that's something I could have done. That's something I probably, to be slightly fair to myself, if I had spent more time on it, I think I would have dug into that. But I didn't. But I should have known that, hey, Tom, you don't know the assumptions to this model. You really should not trust it as much as I did. That was a mistake. The IHME did really well for like about a month early on.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, oh, these guys got it nailed. And I started trusting it again based on its track record, not too much, without understanding the causal how it was working. So that
And
that was a huge error on my part. And actually, I think that's kind of a common error you see even in finance. People make these investing models, and I'd seen this in investing before, and then it works for a little while, and you come to think that that's a true model of the world, and you start to forget the assumptions that go into it and how those assumptions might be bad.
speaking of that IMHE model, that's one that has definitely gotten a lot of media attention as well, and one that was sort of drew a lot of was a driving factor behind a lot of the media headlines throughout the past pandemic. That model has shown up quite a lot. Do you think that there should be more done on the part of the media to understand the assumptions of models, as well as tracking the track record of these models when they're reporting them in the news? Because I believe it was the IMHE model that was used quite a lot to give a lot of dire sort of forecast in like the middle of last year, and a lot of them didn't sort of pan out. And do you think that how models are being used in the media and how sort of track records are, do you think there needs to be uh, better work done on that when it comes to reporting?
Um, I don't have any strong opinion, but I'd always love to see people talk about the assumptions that go into any model, and how those assumptions might be wrong.
Mhm. And so you mentioned that your weakness of your forecast was relying on that model. What do you think was the greatest strength of your approach to COVID forecasting, and that other people forecasting COVID could have learned through your experience?
That's a good question. I I don't spend as much time thinking about what I do right. I spend a lot more time thinking about what I do wrong. So I don't have a good canned response. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe one of the mistakes early on is people assuming a linear model of growth of cases as opposed to an exponential. Um, but yeah, I don't have anything beyond that. I think people picked up on that eventually.
Are there things that you have sort of picked up or learned from other super forecasters that you used in these forecasts that you plan to use in the future? Um, yeah, like do you have people that you collaborate with, or certain people that you borrowed from or shared best practices with?
Or did you also learn things from other COVID forecasters out there as well, not just super forecasters?
Hmm. Don't I don't have any great answers. I basically I did the COVID forecasting when these questions were coming out, and then basically stopped once the questions stopped being launched. So that was probably June of last year. I basically went cold turkey and just waited for the results to come in. Yeah, I don't have a great answer.
Problem. Okay, so that was really fascinating, and we're going to have a lot of links in the description of this video, so people can go and look at your forecast themselves, and maybe go over them as they watch the interview to have a better understanding of the thinking behind them. But now we're going to go into the concluding questions that we have, and we just have a couple, so it shouldn't take too much of your time, Tom. But the first one is, do you have any recommendations for other forecasters who, like you, want to be on the right side of maybe more often than they are right now?
Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman is an awesome book. I mean, I have a whole bunch. The Michael Malbison wrote some great books. Practice. I think there's no substitute for doing practice. Maybe the key message is, if you don't do a calibration quiz, there's really absolutely no way for you to know if you're properly calibrated, because everyone looks at themselves in the mirror and says, of course I'm properly calibrated. I mean, that's the way I was. And then the only way to know is to do a quiz, to get feedback, and learn if in fact you are. So I think there's no substitute for actually doing it, getting the feedback, and learning about yourself.
And then actually this is quite timely because on Monday, Scott Alexander on his new blog Astral Codex 10 just released his list of predictions for 2021, and included that is a series of personal forecasts about his personal life as well as his work life. Do your forecasting skills and forecasting practice have any impact on your personal life? Do you make forecast about your private or professional life? And are doing those forecasts easier or harder? Are they just different?
Yeah, I don't forecast on my private life, and I think that there is a fundamental challenge even to any organization bringing forecasting in, that I've seen firsthand, is when you can affect the outcome, it you get some very weird psychological effects going on, because your forecast can affect maybe how hard you try to do it, or even worse. I've seen this even firsthand. Let's say you have a group of people and you're forecasting in a business context. Hey, will this product sell a lot or not, or how much will it sell? And I was on the this actually happened. I offered a pessimistic forecast, and I tried to make it's very uncomfortable, because other people can say, well, Tom, you're being pessimistic because you don't believe in our ability, and that's kind of demoralizing. And I tried to make it really, really clear, like, oh no, I'm like, not because of our team. It's like, I just don't think there's going to be demand for this product that we're trying to make. But it ends up uh, creating tension, and then I think maybe it creates the perception, if you were in a group forecasting, hey, what maybe you two guys were forecasting, like, hey, how's this podcast gonna do? And let's say you were the one who's on the low end. Well, then your partner might be like, wow, is this guy trying to like tank this forecast so that he gets a better Briar score because he doesn't want people to do it and he wants to be at the top of the leaderboard? It creates these weird incentives. I think it may even create some mistrust between people. So I've actually kind of come to the conclusion. I mean, look, at Maby, we were trying to help organizations bring forecasting in. and have it be useful to them. And I think my recommendation has always been to start off, really don't forecast anything that your organization has, where your organization has control over the outcome. Try to forecast things that are relevant to your organization, but really outside of your control.
More like
So
market specific.
like maybe you're a pharma company and you really care about whether a regulation is going to be passed, and that's super relevant to your business. That's an ideal thing to forecast, because then, if I forecast high or low, my teammates aren't going to say like, oh, Tom's not trying hard, because I have no control over whether that legislation gets passed or not. So that's kind of a subtle lesson that I've seen crop up a bunch of places. So as a first step to making forecasting more useful in the world, I would say don't forecast on anything where you have the control over the outcome.
So like if like I'm like Elon Musk, I would want to forecast like, will the US government, you know, give out funds for private, space contracting companies, rather than will my next booster rocket have a successful launch. It's getting sort of detaching yourself and putting it on like a different level. So
That would be my recommendation. Yeah, because imagine you were Elon Musk and then you're like super pessimistic about that probability of success. Well, then you might inadvertently end up demoralizing all your employees. I just think that there's these weird psychological risks that come into play.
And then just quickly, given your work with Maby, I was curious as to how you see the future of forecasting, sort of like progressing. Are companies seemingly receptive to this idea of forecasting that may be different from how they did things internally before, or have you seen a lot of pushback against a lot of sort of the stuff that we all like and are interested in, like related to the science of forecasting? Like where are people today?
What I see, the conclusions I've come to are that almost everyone who I talk to will agree that you can do these forecasting methods and it will improve group forecasts, that it actually works, that you can empirically measure that the group comes to better forecasts. So I feel like we've done this. We probably don't have enough data to say that definitively, but anecdotally, that's what I have seen. And I think everyone basically agrees with it. But it is shockingly hard for groups to adopt it. And I think it comes about because you're asking people to make, at least when it comes to trying to do forecasting in an organization, it requires a behavior change. You have to run a meeting differently. You have to sell your colleagues on it. Maybe you have to sell your boss on it. And that's just a big hurdle. So I guess my personal forecast is that forecasting, as it becomes more mainstream, will be more broadly adopted, much more broadly adopted 5 to 10 years from now. But I'd also say things take longer than it seems like they should. So I thought forecasting was really going to take off, and I think it's going to just take a while. You just have to be patient for it to make its way into organizations and make its way into government decision making.
So you said 5 to 10 years. What is the resolution criteria on much more adoption, and what's the likelihood on that?
Yeah. Well, we didn't talk about that. I don't know how to write. Yeah, that's a whole other. How to convert that into a firm forecast? I don't know. Yeah, we need a resolution criteria to actually grade me on this.
Well, Tom, this has been great. Thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom, both on forecasting as well as going deep with us in your COVID forecasting. For the listeners out there, if you enjoyed this episode, you'll want to tune in again this Saturday, next week Saturday, when both Tom Liptay, who's been here today, as well as his business partner, Michael Story, will be joining us for the Global Guessing Weekly podcast, where they'll be talking to us a little bit more about their background, their work with Good Judgement, and maybe forecasting. Tom, where can our listeners find you?
I occasionally send out tweets on Twitter. Yeah, or you can always send me an email, tliptay@gmail.com. Always happy to talk forecasting.
And you can find Maby over at maby.app as well. Oh, I'm not sharing that right as well, but it's maby.app.
Yeah, maybe the quick pitch is, hey, there's an app out there. It's free. You can write questions and you can run an automated Delphi method with your group of friends where you can make anonymous comments, vote on each other's comments. So it can remove some of these biases in decision making and remove some of the groupthink by reading comments without knowing who said it. And then ultimately, it creates a scoreboard and a calibration curve, so you can find out if you are calibrated on real world questions that matter to you. And again, right now, basically, it's free. This is a side project for us. We're just delighted if anyone uses it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been The Right Side of Maby with our guest, Tom Liptay. And that is perfect timing. So thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.